we have this, and it should look awfully familiar. It says to complete this model of DNA by adding its matching half, be sure to draw and label all 4 of your matching bases. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make the shapes line up. So we know that a shape like this is going to line up there. We know that a shape like that is going to line up here. We know that a shape like that is going to line up there, and a shape like that is going to line up there. Now these shapes have names. We're going to look kind of at this to remember what those names are. If we forgot that, apples in the tree, car in the garage, or straight lines go with straight lines and curvy lines go with curvy lines. But this shape has a T on it, so we're going to put a T on this shape. This shape looks like that shape, so we're going to put a C here. And this shape looks like that shape, so we're going to put an A here. This shape looks like that shape, so we're going to put a G here. We're still not quite done yet because we have to draw in the backbone, that sugar phosphate backbone. Just make it look like the top. I think when I give you the final quiz, I'm going to have the backbone already written there and just have you put in the bases. So yeah, we have to have both the shapes and the letters. The shapes and the letters, because that is the draw and label part of this question. Okay, so question 7. What shape is the DNA molecule? This has been written on the board. I think I've explicitly said it a couple times. This is kind of a memorize the word kind of a question. The DNA shape is a double helix, which is the twisty ladder shape. So that's what DNA's shape is. It's a double helix. Globular was a word that I think threw some people off when I took this original based on what questions I got. Globular was kind of a made-up-ish word saying like a glob pile. DNA, the actual molecules, DNA molecules, little bits, are not goopy or globby. They are really organized into that twisted ladder shape. Okay, so question 8 is a tough one. If you remember the orange cups, that kind of helped you get these ready. Question 8 asks, in your own words, explain 2 reasons this shape is important to the function of DNA. And it gives you kind of 2 starters. Now, this doesn't have to be a paragraph. These can be just kind of short little answers, and it's just saying, why is the shape important to the function? So you don't have to really describe the shape. I just want you to say how it's important, because you kind of describe the shape here. So this shape is important because, think back to it being, this shape being super long and super thin. It's important because it can store lots of information in a tiny amount of space. That's an easy one to remember. It can store lots of info in a small space. And that is perfectly fine for one of them. And it asks for another one. And it says it's also important because, let's think, what else does it do? Keeping that strong backbone in place and keeping all of these little pieces in a line. Keep the computer code in order. It keeps the code in order. That's another one. You can write down that one. You can also write down that it can autocorrect because it's double-stranded. You can write down a whole bunch of things. But I'm going to write down it's also important because it keeps the computer code in order. And that's like an analogy. It's not actually computer code, just the DNA code. It keeps the computer code in order. And I'm going to also write so it can code for traits. You could, this itself would be fine, but because this is my example, I'm going to make it a little bit better. Keeps the computer code in order so it can code specific traits. So it can code specific traits. And again, it also helps split it up so that way the offspring can have exactly half. It's easy to duplicate. It can autocorrect. Millions and millions of reasons why the shape is important. I wish I could have chatted about it more, but hopefully you remember that orange cup activity. Super important. So question 9. Question 9 says, which of the following is not something that would result in a mutation? And if we think back to our pop bead activity, we made mistakes when we replicated the DNA, and those mistakes I called mutations. because they changed the order of the DNA sequence. It like switched up one of these little bases, made a mistake. I mean, we fixed that mistake. It was still different. Like it ended up with either 3 pairs or 5 pairs if you had an addition or a deletion, and if you had a substitution and you fixed it so that they would stick together again, you still switched the order, right? So that was a mutation. So let's look at these. So A says 2 similar species from different habitats mate. Now that doesn't really have anything to do with changing the DNA. Yes, you would get a different combination of the DNA, but you wouldn't actually change the DNA. You would just get a different set of it. I hope that makes sense. But when 2 things that are super different mate, you get different combinations of alleles. You get different combinations of traits, but you never make a new trait. A mutation is something that can make something brand new that nothing has ever had before. Anyway, so that is what A says. B says, an extra base is added in the DNA replication. Hey, that's just like what we did on our model. We added an extra base. And that caused a mutation because then you had another base in the sequence. So the sequence was different. So that could change everything because it shifted everything. Now let's look at C. The wrong base is added in DNA replication. Hey, that's what we did when we made the mistake in our drawing, where we made a picture of something not lining up. And that would, again, change the DNA sequence and tell the DNA to code for putting the Legos in a wrong order, putting the different Legos in the different spots, which would make a different gene, which would make a different trait that you hadn't had before, ever. So let's look at these again. This is something happening in replication. This is something happening in replication. This is not something happening in replication. So it is not something that would result in a mutation. It could because it could replicate wrong, but it wouldn't for sure result in a mutation because it's not something happening in replication. Okay? So the question says, one example of a GMO is a blank, because it is. So this is where we put an example of a GMO, and this is why we explain why. Now, we watched a video today, or are watching a video today that will hopefully explain this a little bit better, but I'm going to go ahead and put in an example of how to answer this question here. An example of a GMO is a corn plant. Now, if I just left it as corn plant, not all corn plants are GMOs. But the reason I put because will help explain why I said corn plant. So you could put pretty much anything here as long as you give a good because. So an example of a GMO is a corn plant because it has been genetically modified to produce its own pesticide. So some corn plants have been genetically modified because genetically modified organism, GMO, it has been genetically modified to produce its own pesticides. And that was something in the video we watched. You can put any GMOs here, and as long as you say why, go for it. And I'd request you don't use corn plant. If you use this same example as me, I will probably mark a half a point off on the test because that means you just copied this. I'd like you to use your own example, okay? Thank you. Hope you enjoyed this little explanation.